So can I request the panelists to kindly come to the dais? Mr. Abhishek Jain, Director, Powering Livelihood, Council for Energy, Environment and Water. Professor Haripriya Gundimeda, IIT Mumbai. Mr. Kumar Sambhav, Founder and Director, Land Conflict Watch. Dr. Ruchika Singh, Executive Program Director, Food, Land and Water, WRI India. Mr. Silas Nagar, IntelliCap, and in the chair, Nitin Desai, former member of Planning Commission and former Union Secretary General, Economics and Social Affairs of United Nations. So please take your seats. And I am handing over the proceedings to the chair. Please carry on, sir.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this session, and welcome to all of you for this side event that is going to take place. I'm here, I suppose, because I have been working a lot on climate issues rather than on the commons. But the theme of this session is on connecting the issue of commons with that of the climate action which is there. Connecting climate action and commons, policy, pathways, opportunities, and challenges. This is something that has been talked about a lot, but in a very narrow context of saying that if we do a lot of work on restoring commons, we will be putting in more greenery there that will absorb more carbon, and so on and so forth. And in fact, there are already instances of some of these work being done on commons being supported by voluntary carbon payments. So that's just, in a way, rather basic and simple part. I think a more broader point that I would raise is that if I were to look at the challenge of climate action in India, mitigation by reducing carbon emissions is just one part of it. In fact, perhaps increasingly something which is not going to deliver the results that we want. And increasingly our focus has to be on adaptation, on coping with the increase in climate, temperature, in changes in the availability of water, in the risks of higher adverse weather, etc. And this is particularly important in rural areas. I cannot today talk in terms of addressing climate action in rural areas unless I also connect it with adaptation. Because that's the real challenge in rural India particularly, to adapt to the fact that there will be unavoidable changes in temperature, etc. So this is a broader issue which also we need to look at. How do I connect the work that I need to do on adaptation to climate change with the work that we will do on supporting, restoring, improving, etc., the commons? A third dimension which I would address is this, that one of the things that is being done in the area of coping with climate change is renewable energy. Now, one very key part of this renewable energy, particularly solar energy, is a heavy demand for land. A very heavy demand for land is required for the amount of energy that we will have to produce through renewables and so on. It's already happening to some extent in India, but it also happens elsewhere. So this dimension, that is this something which could also intrude on commons in time? Because of the heavy demand for land that will arise, because of the transition in energy that we require. And in many ways, the agenda that has been set for this session covers these areas, not just connecting commons and climate change from the perspective of climate mitigation, but also looking at the adaptation issues, and also looking at possible tension and conflict issues between what we would wish to do on commons and what people are trying to do on climate action. We are very fortunate that we have 5 people here who are going to talk to us on this. You will probably already have some information on who they are, but let me just start from here. To my right is Haripriya. She has been doing excellent work in many areas, and I have connected with her earlier when the work on forests was used by us when we were doing a report on green accounting. The other person that I have there is Anurag, and he's from CEW. This is the organization which has come up in a very fine way in the work that it has done. It's not just on climate, it's on energy and also, and water. In fact, the W there stands for water. So this is a very broad-based organization. I'm very happy that he is here. And I have you, Abhishek Jain.
I'm from CW. I'm from CW.
Oh, you're from CW. You're not from CW.
Land conflict watch.
You're the land conflict person. Sorry, you're the CW one. My apologies to you. So he's from CW. He's from the land conflict one of the sponsors of this session. I also have somebody from WRI, the World Resources Institute, which is also quite very active globally, and she's part of the Indian setup of WRI, and so I look forward to that. And we have Sailesh from IntelCap, which is also quite involved in these areas. So we're going to start listen to them, and then perhaps see what comes out of their assessments on these 3 dimensions that I mentioned. So the first one I have to turn to, if I note correctly, let me see. I think it's Haripriya, you come first. Right? Haripriya, if I may ask you. Yeah. And the question that has been listed for you in my setup here is, how can the concept of commons be integrated into the national and international climate action agenda? What steps can be taken to ensure that common management is prioritized in climate policies and frameworks? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's really a delight to be here addressing all of you and be part of this session. This is a very challenging question. I mean, before answering this, I think I just want to go back to the basic framework of the commons problem. When we talk about the commons, it's just not only like, usually when we talk about the commons, we think there is the villages and there's a pasture lands and everything. But everything is a common resource. Even at the international level, we have many commons, global commons. Now, the key problem with these kind of resources is these are public goods in the economic sense. Now, when we talk about the public goods, there are 2 key features of these public goods. One is a non-excludability and rivalry or non-rivalry. Now, I would categorize the goods into these 2 kinds to be able to give the answer for this. Now, if the moment I'm not able to exclude you, what happens is, even though I don't contribute to the provision of the good, but still I would be the beneficiary of the good, right? So in that context, there are 2 things which can happen. Now, if it's a rivalry, that is my consumption decreases your consumption. That basically is the non-excludable and rival good, which is basically the case of the pasture lands or the fisheries and all these. These are all the commons. But then one's consumption is leading to decline in the utility of the other person. Now, in these kind of scenarios, what we have is appropriation of the resource as much as possible, right? That leads to the tragedy of the commons kind of situation, which Garrett Hardin has actually mentioned. Now, there is also the other situation wherein my consumption would not in any way lead to less of consumption of yours. For example, air pollution or climate change. Nobody can, you cannot exclude anybody from suffering from climate change. And in the same process, I do not suffer less, right? Now, these create a typical kind of problem called as prisoner's dilemma kind of problems in economics, where we say that the self-interest dominate the social interest. Everybody thinks in their own self-interest. Nobody thinks about the social interest. And these kind of situations also gives rise to free riding kind of problem, because it's like, okay, fine, you are doing anyway, you can't exclude me, so I can also let me be the beneficiary. So that leads to the under provision of the resource. Now, that provides a particular challenge. Now, if you look at, now because the session is about how do we bring this into the global agenda or the international agenda and also the NDCs. So this is a problem we need to regard, that unless and until it's coordinated by everyone, everybody should actually, it's a collective provision. Only then you would actually ensure that you would be able to do something. So that itself is a point wherein we can say that this definitely deserves a need for a coordinated action, both at the national and the international level. So we are not even talking about the local commons. Local commons are pretty much easier, because this is a kind of, because I live in the village, I need to have good relationship with the villagers. It's a kind of a repeated game, right? I will not try to break the rules in any case. Like, if there are some set of rules set in governing the resource, is much more easier than governing these kind of global and national and international commons. So the key thing is we definitely need to have this coordinated responsibility, and that's the reason why we have agenda like the climate change that's the reason why everybody, all the nations have to collectively do something, otherwise it's undone. So that's definitely, we need to bring in more coordinated mechanism. That's the only way through which we can actually bring the issue of governance or commons into the national and the international agendas. Yeah.
I turn to Shailesh, please.
So I think the question of how to integrate commons in policies, climate policies and climate action. And first background, my background, although I am currently in a private sector consulting firm, I spent 10 years of initial professional life in FES, so I understand commons, and once you are in FES, you always will think of commons and you will speak about commons. When I was thinking about this question which was given, there were two things which I thought, that one is recognition, second is resources. In terms of recognition, if I look at different national and international policies, programs and all, what you find is that while the word commons is not there, but commons is tied with communities. We were in the morning talking about commoning, commoners, and commons. So the community definitely gets a mention everywhere. Whether it is community-based approaches, whether it is ecosystem adaptation, everywhere you will find everyone is talking about community involvement and all that. So at that level, there is involvement, there is, in that sense, mention of commons. It's well accepted at international and national level. We have very strong laws like FRA, community forests. We have in northeastern areas, we have community conservation areas. We have PISA laws, which are very strong laws, and other policies also. NAPCC, I was just looking at NAPCC, and NAPCC mentions communities 23 times in different contexts, whether it is DRR, whether it is ecosystem-based approaches, whether it is forest, water, all the common resources. So where is the issue? So when I looked at my own experience of working with NGOs, and now in the private sector, I work across different actors, including rights-based group, including private companies, including DFIs and others. In my experience, I think the problems are twofold. One is when it comes to execution, the interests and power which Haripriya was talking about, they override all these provisions. Programmatic structures and operationalization, these are the major issues when you go to the ground level. I was also talking to someone where, and he was talking about FRA, and FRA implementation got stuck at the level that, while provisions are there, there is some ambiguity, and that ambiguity is taken, by the interested department, and they are not allowing progress to happen. So programmatic structure, and I'm also involved in a lot of large-scale DFI projects on forest. The time, targets, and the way these projects are designed do not allow the implementers to include. So despite efforts for inclusion of, let's say, principles of governance of commons, these do not happen at the ground level. In operationalization, I also feel that there is major lack of understanding and awareness among different stakeholders, especially within the government. The concept of commons, broadly they understand, but no one has executed on ground, so they have no idea of how to implement it. So these are some of the things. Coming to resources, which is the second portion of impediments in integrating commons in climate action. I was again doing a very broad research, and what came out was commons are starved of resources. So while we have very large figures, let's say I just take the example of forest areas, and when we are saying commons, I think it is also linked to institutions, it is linked to livelihoods, and it is linked to restoration efforts. So if I looked, when I looked at forests, so the figures which came out was around 30 to 40,000 crores in India annually, which is spent, and which comes to roughly around 2,500 to 3,000 rupees per hectare, which gets invested. Now, where is this investment going? 60 to 70% of this investment is going in plantation activities, and 10 to 20% is going on institution building. And when you deep dive into institution building, where is it going? It is primarily going in infrastructure. So forest department infrastructure, nowadays for last 5-10 years, we are also talking about digital infrastructure. So that is getting built, which is required, not to say that it is not required, but very less is going towards institution building at different levels of community. And which is what I saw in my previous engagement with FES, where a lot of investment was there in institution building, and which is what is required if we want commons to play a critical role in climate action. So, and third thing is that we do a lot of work on financing. So financing of various development activities, including climate action as well as natural resources. Commons are very, very difficult in terms of bringing in finance, because most of the finance is going to come from public financial sources. At present, everyone is talking about private capital, but private capital will not get attracted to commons primarily because there is no commercial interest in that. So somewhere there has to be kind of blending of different kind of finances. And why I am saying this is that when we are looking at commons, they will also have to provide livelihoods. And when we are talking about livelihoods, wherever markets can play a role, there the private capital can come in and play that kind of a role. But it has to be on the basis, on the ground of public finance, which basically is invested in conservation activity. So there has to be some kind of linkages between that. I'll stop here.
One thing which has come up in the discussions is the role of forest policy and climate policy, the connectivity. I would want to hear from Haripriya and anybody else as to what does this imply? Does it mean that we start ignoring other dimensions of what forest services that forests serve? Or should we just focus on carbon sequestration as the main goal of forest policy, or should we be looking at others? And we also mentioned one more thing. There is a Supreme Court judgment which actually specifies what are the dimensions of forest impact that you have to take into account in the payments that you make when you take up a forest. To the best of my recollection, That does not include climate. Those Supreme Court rules do not include climate. They include many other things. They're quite generous in some ways, but they do not include climate. So I would like a little reaction from you, Haripriya, and you on what do you see from this perspective of the way in which forest policy is being set in India. You mentioned one important dimension, the institutional dimension. I'm just thinking of this dimension. If could,
I think seeing forests just for carbon is a mistake, according to me, because carbon sequestration is only one of the services which is provided by forests. In terms of the quantification, I've done a lot of work on the forest valuation. Recently, we did the Sanjay Gandhi National Park. So what we found was, for example, the air purification services of forests stand apart, right? We don't see that, but then it does. And then also, like, it provides a lot of habitat and existence values. So obviously, like, yes, they do play an important role in the whole climate change, because they are sequestering carbon in the soils. Forest soil is a big store of carbon. Then the trees, as they grow, they also sequester carbon. But then the moment you make forest policy, the climate change is the center of the forest policy, what you are just missing out the larger figure. You might end up planting short-term trees like poplar, eucalyptus, which are fast-growing species, and then you quickly get the carbon credits, and that's it. But then you are missing out the biodiversity part. That's the reason why we also have this RED plus. That plus also includes the biodiversity. I think the strategy would be like whether you want to like reap the short-term gains or you want to take the long-term gains. Now, if you have a far vision, I think you have to make biodiversity as a part of the forest policy strategy.
Yeah, just quickly responding to this, that was another point I missed. We have payment for ecosystem services, and there are a couple of examples in our country also. Recently, there was a World Bank project in Meghalaya, which started this PES, and then the Meghalaya government took it over, and then now they are providing some 15,000 or 25,000 per hectare to people who keep the land as forest land. But now PES can be designed for carbon. And the problem is that in biodiversity and water services, that kind of measurement is still missing. So I think, in my view, we are still waiting for that to emerge so that we can create some kind of mechanisms which can incentivize the other services. So I think it's not the problem with the intention. Of course, there is a larger push for carbon and all that. But I think even if you want to do work on water incentives or incentives for water conservation or for biodiversity, the problem is what's the kind of unit which is there in carbon but not in others.
Only thing that you should be concerned with. Let me now turn to let's move on a little. The next question that was raised was the connectivity between commons, climate action, and adaptation. Ruchika, can I ask you to?
Now it's on. Thank you. I think it's an important question to sort of, I'll just reflect a bit more on what's the role of, commons can play in strengthening community resilience, essentially. And I think Haripriya sort of, I'll start from what Haripriya and, Sailesh said. While there is a lot of focus on mitigation aspects, which essentially, the carbon piece is highlighted, but if we are thinking about the kind of climate impacts that we are already facing, if we are thinking in terms of unprecedented sometimes rain that happens in short-term periods, or heat waves, or droughts, etc., which are we do really need to also think about what kind of sort of strategies we are thinking for rural communities, especially where resilience can be built for local communities against some of these shocks, and that's where role of commons become critical, which is and not just about the mitigation aspects, but also from a resilience perspective. and how we think about how commons can help with different sort of ecosystem services, for instance, as an example. We are thinking not just of provisioning services, for instance, thinking about food, thinking about biodiversity, water, cultural services. So there's a whole sort of different services that we can think about, and it just doesn't have to be a very carbon climate focused aspects, because that's not the only way that one should potentially look at that. And the other sort of important sort of element when thinking about how we sort of think about role of commons is, what are we considering, what are commons? And I think Sailesh, you sort of hinted at that a bit. There's a lot more focus on forestry commons, but as Haripriya also said, we have other kind of commons as well. How do we think about, for instance, grasslands? Lot more focus on trees and restoration only of a particular kind, but grasslands are important. How are we thinking about other sort of aspects related to that? So we need a much more sort of integrated approach when we're thinking about commons and how communities' resilience can be built in. Some of our own sort of learnings on this has been that when we are thinking about building community resilience in context of commons, we really need to think about it in context of the entire landscape. I mean, essentially then it becomes about what are the different land use, land ownerships, and if we are thinking about the entire landscape within which the commons are also there, and how we think about what sort of, where you are thinking about protecting, where you're thinking about planning, and essentially more inclusive strategies, if they are built, that is really going to lead to more shared understanding around, what sort of intervention should also be done on ground. And this is critical because, it's important to also think about jobs, livelihood opportunities that the forest commons or grasslands and, can also provide, which is overlooked, primarily. And how do we think about overall from a resilience perspective as well, more what we call as a land-based restoration economy, and it could be of different types, because that's what can help in building strengthening resilience for local communities. What are those livelihood opportunities? How can you mitigate impact by creating the right kind of solutions or interventions which are more locally driven, but doesn't mean we are encroaching on, or doing interventions which are not really appropriate locally. And that's where the complexity is. And I think we sometimes see that all stakeholders may not be on the same page. For instance, on that, one example that always comes to mind is a lot of land in India. I mean, there's, this whole category. I think we were talking before this session with Sambhav that, wastelands is in category. I mean, a lot of wastelands, are they wastelands actually? There are commons and a lot of them are grasslands. How do we think about those, and strategies for that would be different, but is that looked at? So essentially, I'd like to close by just saying that yes, role of commons in strengthening is very critical, but we really do need to have a interdisciplinary but also intersectional approaches, how we think about that, how we plan for commoner, and think about some of those. Yeah.
I think you've taken a broader view. I just want to mention one thing. There is now some talk on the climate side of what is it that we need to do for adaptation in agriculture. But what I notice is that almost all of that talk is on how can I design, how can we make crop varieties which are not as susceptible to uncertainties about water, about high temperature, and so on, or nanofertilizers and so on. I've not yet seen a clear connection between what is being discussed on something like adaptation in rural areas with the commons. One more point I would like to throw in is that one area where I believe commons is central to adaptation to climate change, high temperatures, is urban areas. It's in urban areas that the only real way of meeting the challenge of climate change is to increase the areas of green commons and things of that sort. Now, I don't see any evidence that this is happening or is being seriously considered. So I just thought I'd drop this thing. Would anybody else like to come in on this issue? You would? Come.
Yeah. Now on the agriculture resilience, I think the adaptation story, first of all, as you rightly said, like a lot of the focus is on the crop varieties and seed varieties and so on. But even if you go beyond, the focus is on only what you can do on the farm, but not looking at the landscape approach again, as Ruchira mentioned, because that integration really adds to a lot more resilience. Your soil quality is not going to improve only by working on the farm. Of course, it does impact, but what do you do in the common areas, especially if you are in a low-lying area and there is a uplying area and the biomass, etc., is going to come to your field. What you do with your commons have a significant impact on the soil erosion and the soil quality and so on. And we often overlook how soil is such a critical piece of agricultural resilience. I think a lot of focus on water, but soil gets overlooked quite a bit. And the more we are losing the topsoil, which is at an unprecedented rate, we are losing topsoil. The more we are losing the agricultural resilience, the more shallow the roots become of the plants, the less they withstand the floods and droughts. So that is, I think, a dimension which is completely missing, that how do we take the landscape approach, be it on water management and soil management, and built into the agriculture resilience.
Which was raised. First was the connecting climate and policies on climate and commons. Second was on broadening thinking, not just from mitigation to adaptation. The third issue was what I was talking about, possible conflicts between what you want to do for climate action and what you ought to do for commons protection. And the example I gave was the land requirement. That may not be the only one. May I ask, would you like to come in on this, Kumar?
Sure. So I think I'll start from where others have left. I would like to make basically 3 points, or sorry, 4 points. We know that there is excessive focus on mitigation and there's little focus on adaptation, which is where I think the whole idea about going big on investing on renewable energy, going big on carbon sequestration, plantation projects, etc., comes in. And unfortunately, there also we see that the interdependence of commons and communities for resilience, for livelihood, for their socio-economic rights, etc., doesn't get factored in. Now, this, while theoretically, yes, is a problem. We have had this legacy problem in India and many southern, global south countries where land and resources rights is a big problem. Now, when that continues, even in the mitigation projects, there is a real cost in real time that we are facing. So it's not even that we're not talking about what may happen in future. We at Land Conflict Watch, we have been tracking at least 35 renewable energy projects where there are conflicts on the ground, where communities' rights are being ridden roughshod over. And so there is renewable energy projects. Similar issues are with the plantation projects. There are over 70 projects that we are tracking, 70 plantation projects across the country where there are land conflicts on the ground because the plantation that is being imposed upon community lands or commons restricts access to communities' traditional resources that they were using, or even takes away their livelihood. And then while there is some discourse emerging on just transition, we are all talking about when the transition is happening from fossil fuel to renewable, what happens to jobs of people which are involved in it. There's no discourse on what really happens to the land, right? What happens to the land which is being freed up from the closure of mines, from the closure of coal mines, etc. And that is also emerging to be a problem on the ground already, while there is a deep understanding within social sector, within people working on the ground, that what a just transition means, that when the land was taken over in unjust ways, that should also be addressed. And there are communities which are now demanding that if the closure of mines happen, if commons were taken over or their forest land were taken over, those lands should be given back, or at least the livelihood of those communities should be addressed through those lands. So first they lost land, then they lost jobs because of the transition from coal to renewable, and now they don't get anything in return when the transition is happening. So we have, take example of Jharkhand, where there was my colleague Sukriti is there. She documented this from the ground, where there was a policy, there was a task force for just transition, and there was understanding within the task force that yes, the land should be returned to the communities, but forget returning to the communities, the mining companies have not even returned the land to the state after several years of closure of mines. So that land is being hoarded and is left unused. And there are, conflicts emerging. So we have the legacy issues of unjust takeover of land that plagued fossil fuels extraction is prevailing even in the new form of transition that we're talking about, clean energy, etc. In all these examples of renewable energy where conflicts are happening, there is bypassing of laws, a lot of this is commons as we're talking about. Like this one case in Maharashtra where the land is classified as class 2 land, which basically was earlier commons and then sort of allotted to landless people, mostly marginalized communities, Dalits and other landless farmers, for their use. And now we see there is a renewable energy project that comes up. The brokers sign power of attorney and then take over this land from these people for whatever price or little price that is agreed to. There's not even following of the proper procedure of land acquisition law, where a social impact assessment happens, where a cost and compensation calculation of the land happens. None of this really takes place on the ground. And because of these conflicts, there already large amount of investment. We estimated it to be about 60,000 crore of investment worth of renewable energy projects are either delayed or stalled or are stuck in court cases because these procedures are not being followed. So when we say that there is like immense amount of money coming globally for mitigation projects, but unless this adaptation aspect of how commons, communities' rights, their customary practices, and their interdependence in maintaining the resilience of commons and landscape is addressed, I think even the effectiveness of mitigation measures is really not going to come through. I'll stop there.
Comment on this is, you're very right to point out the issue. But would anybody else like to come back?
I can quickly add. In fact, with WRI Terry, we also do a lot of work on this conflict on the land when it comes to renewable energy projects. And the conflicts, of course, are one which are related to livelihoods and lives. Now, within livelihood, it could be access to the pastoral land, grazing lands. It could be NTFP access, and sometimes it could be the fuel wood access and so on. But then it comes to the religious sites sometimes on these lands, which are then cordoned off and the communities do not have access to, and so on. But I think what it really also boils down to is this classification and the nomenclature issue. When the state governments end up classifying these as wastelands and deliberately also then gets prioritized as the priority lands for the RE projects. So there are state policies, you look at Rajasthan, you look at Gujarat, where in the policies itself, the state is prioritizing the state wasteland towards RE projects. So policy itself is pushing it in the direction where common lands become the first priority for sort of these RE projects. And that is because the nomenclature and the classification is not nuanced at all. It is a colonial nomenclature that we are still using when it comes to wasteland just from the revenue perspective, but not looking at the ecological as well as the local economical benefits that these lands are providing. So I think a lot more nuanced classification and nomenclature needs to come in so that right at the beginning, the policies at least are not pushing us in a direction which is not desirable. I think the second thing comes, again, another example now, not from the RE projects, but from afforestation projects, is again poor nomenclature and classification when a lot of these lands get classified as degraded forests. And then the afforestation projects get pushed on them. But if the only dimension of afforestation projects is carbon mitigation, the species choices and other things are only sort of optimized for that one unidimensional output. Right? So all the other benefits, whether it is other ecological services, could be biodiversity, could be water, and so on and so forth, or it could be the local economical services, get sidelined. I think one way to solve for this is the market which is demanding for the carbon credits. If you push for more and more carbon plus credits, that then sort of already starts changing the mindset of the developers that we are not really only trying to optimize for the maximum carbon, but rather the maximum value of the credit which will come from the carbon plus plus. So instead of making it a volumes game, can we make it a value game? And I think a lot of sensitization with the corporates, with the buyers of these credits need to happen. That instead of asking for a carbon credit, the first ask has to be, especially if it is a nature-based solution credit of any sorts, whether it is from wetlands, mangroves, from afforestation and so on, the demand should be a carbon plus plus, like how this credit is actually also adding to the social side, to the other environmental benefits and so on. I think that would slowly nudge the project development in a direction where we are not sort of only optimizing for carbon, that unidimension approach that we're discussing.
Just quick sort of 30 seconds on the trade-offs with energy. I think Abhishek and Kumar mentioned most of it, but the other piece where sort of, expansion of RE with land, limited land, increasing population is also with food production that sort of needs to be thought of, and how we're going to manage that. I mean, one of the things that's becoming clear with sort of, and the IPCC reports also have mentioned that South Asia is going to be impacted quite widely because of this. So, and yields going down. So how we are thinking about the amount of land we might need for, just feeding the population. And I'm not even talking about nutritional security. That's a completely different sort of, much conversation. But even from that perspective, and now there are conversations around agri-photovoltaics, which kind of goes into agriculture, how we are thinking about agriculture and agri-PV. So there's a lot to be unpacked essentially when we're thinking about trade-offs between land, RE projects in commons, but also in other aspects. And because it's all same landscapes, it is a bit of an interrelated problem that needs to be thought of as, yeah.
Yes, concurring with Abhishek on both the points. One is the classification of in terms of wasteland, and this is not new. 15, 20 years ago when I was doing my MPhil, I wrote a thesis on biofuels. Exactly the same thing. You do the land pooling, every collector is asked to create a list of land which are available, and then you basically push it. And even before that, and I think it is happening since 1980s, the classification is not changing. I think that is one of the major problems. No one is recognizing the user rights on those lands, and that's not getting documented, and that is creating a whole lot of problem every now and then. The second point on the carbon plus plus, I think I totally agree. Any financing facility which gets designed should be carbon plus water plus biodiversity plus social. So it cannot be only a single carbon kind of financing facility.
I think this is a very valuable proposition that you're putting up, the whole notion carbon plus plus. Let me just add one thing to what was being said here. There's a lot of focus on the relative neglect of what the impact on land, etc. is. Another area is water. A large number of the things that we are trying to do on climate action are going to pose huge demands for water. Take, for instance, green hydrogen. There's going to be a huge demand for water. Now, particularly in India, we have to be really much more cautious and careful. So I think there's a lot to be said for the carbon plus plus notion, that we don't just give carbon credits. It has to be carbon credit connected with what it does to land or water. So the reality today is that I can go to a corporation and persuade them to take interest in carbon mitigation. I cannot persuade them to take interest in land conservation or water conservation. And this is where the notion of carbon plus plus may be very valuable, and I hope that the people who are here will work this up. Now let's move to a slightly broader issue, the fourth one which has been mentioned here, which is this whole area and the broader theme of conservation, which was raised initially by Haripriya when she spoke about forests. So let me just ask her in the broader sense of biodiversity and conservation that you're talking about, uh, how do you see the connectivity between these issues? Or does climate convention really require also a stronger emphasis on conservation in the broader sense, rather than just how do I reduce carbon?
Yes, I do agree that they should be connected. The reason being, see, like, there are multiple stakeholders, we all know about it. But if you ask the local people, like, whether they would actually conserve the trees for carbon, they would not. What they require is day-to-day, like the fruits, the nuts. Now, the commercial aspect need to be brought in, right? Now, the commercial aspect can only be brought in if you are acting multi-diverse species, like the fruit trees, and this, it should also be like a kind of a win-win scenario. You can't just use my land and take credits to finance someone like which is, I mean, they are not even connected with that. They don't even know what these credits are. This is just a hot air, which we have created markets for, right? So unless you involve the local people and make it a conservation kind of effort, we cannot actually reap the benefits. I can also quote another example. Recently, I'm doing some work for Tadoba Andari Tiger Reserve. We are trying to value the tiger reserve there. But then the unique model of Tadoba is that it's a very successful story. It's all community driven. So all the villages have been displaced outside, but then they have opened various gates for the safari. And then the people who are residing near the gate, they are the one who actually are the gypsy drivers and safari. It's a kind of whatever revenue that is being made, it's all community shared resource. So when you ask them, they say that, yes, we would like the tiger, this Tadoba to be conserved, right? So they all are aware of, okay, the carbon and all are all secondary for them. But then they know that the tiger exists because the forest exists. And they would like to say, so they basically keep a watch on the reserve, and then they make sure that there is no illegal activity happening there. So unless you bring in the local people and then think about what their interests are, we will not be able to just conserve anything in the name of climate change.
Tiger forest thing, I must tell you a delightful story. It's a friend of mine who had made tons of money from something, and he decided to set up a foundation. And his big interest was protecting tigers. So he started giving money for tiger protection, like usually for putting off cameras, this, that. And after some time, he says, oh, tigers can't be protected unless you protect a forest. So he broadened his team and started giving money for forest protection. Then after some time, he decided you can't protect a forest unless you do something for the people who live off forests. So now he's giving money for that. I just thought you'd like to know that. When they actually start doing things, then it will change. Let me take this, your second point that which is very important, that whatever we do, in the case of commons, it's relatively easy to reach a local population and their concerns and their priorities. Even there, it's a little more complicated than we think. I remember we had, the FES had been doing some projects in Rajasthan. And I had gone there and I visited the villages. The projects were on restoring the forest areas around the village and so on. And it was quite successful. So when I visited those three villages, the people who were talking and explaining what was the value of that gave the explanation entirely in terms of its impact on water. They were not interested in the impact of climate. पानी ऐसा रहा था, ये सिर्फ मार्च महीने तक आता था, अभी तो जून महीने तक आ रहा है, etc. So when we reach out to people at the local level, we must connect in some ways what we are trying to do on these things with their priorities. Today, even in climate, it's easier for me to reach out and get people to work and agree on certain things if I focus on today's air pollution. That will persuade. So I think this is a dimension we ought to be taking into account. We still have time. They started us late, so we can carry on a little late. So what about any comments, questions that you have to each other. Yeah, please.
Just a couple of comments. So one, when we were talking about the renewable energy, the wasteland classification, etc., I think the kind of subsidies provided while they are sort of, in terms of even relaxations of permits and social impact assessment, etc., while they are in the spirit of sort of making addressing the climate change, etc., they're often really not considered in the same spirit when the projects are implemented on the ground. I mean, just a very funny example, I was listening to one random podcast where people were talking about startups. And our Bollywood, this singer, Badshah, everybody knows, he's talking about startups, and then they are talking about what is the big sector in which they should make investments. And they're saying, okay, renewable energy is the sector where everybody needs to make investments, etc. So there's immense profit that is being looked at, but when it comes to sort of compliance and addressing the issues on the ground, and there's very little sort of focus or sort of thrust on these issues being addressed or not. You have certain laws, you have land acquisition law, you have Forest Rights Act, but there's nothing for governing of commons. There's nothing for sort of coding the rights or livelihoods of communities on commons. And when you exempt a lot of these compliances, including social impact assessment, etc., it's not going to happen. I mean, nobody's really, the projects developers are not going to consider. Unfortunately, that is to their own deterrent, because then projects get stuck in courts, then the investments get stalled, etc., which is not being seen, like there's no vision for that. So that's one. Second, I would like to say, add that, while there is economic sort of considerations, just to respond to ma'am, often, I mean, we have been documenting even from tiger reserves when communities are sort of, there might be few good examples where the administration is very sort of careful and considerate that, okay, potentially all the displaced families get some job, or they get guidance. But across the country, when the conservation efforts are also imposed on the communities from a very sort of top-down perspective, what happens is few people get some jobs, mostly others people get menial jobs in tourism industry. And there's a skewed equation of who benefits from this. I mean, the amount of profit that goes to the industry and then what remains goes to the communities is very skewed. There have been guidelines in the past how some amount of profit from the tourism industry should flow to the communities. Those were dismantled eventually, and then now it's obviously in case-to-case basis where any administration is more cognizant, then they would implement. Otherwise, it doesn't really happen, and there's random numbers which are decided, random jobs are decided. So if we have to move across, and it sort of, I'll tie down to the whole point of that communities, commons are sort of interconnected, and the resilience of landscape depends on that. If this is not addressed, I don't think all the other measures are going to be effective in the long run.
Just add and build on what Saksham said. I think it's correct that the EIA, SIA exemptions are there for the RE projects. And that kind of already gives a clean sheet to many of the developers. But interestingly, a lot of the foreign money that is coming in, the foreign investors actually mandate still the EIAs and SIAs to happen. But unfortunately, it still remains that compliance, check in the box kind of approach, right? You do it, but just for the sake of that, yes, it's a investor requirement that we are meeting. But in spirit, the next steps that come out of the assessment, that what all you need to do, doesn't really happen. And even if it happens with the more powerful in the community. So there is that equity dimension comes in, that whether the community is also equally represented or equitably represented when these assessments are happening. And more powerful in the community ends up aligning with the developers and so on. And that's when sometimes in the rest of the community, if that takes it up, it becomes a court case and a legal battle and so on and so forth. So I think there is that equity dimension also to be kept in mind, that commons are not also equally accessible to all because of the prevailing sort of power dynamics in the community and so on. The second piece, I think, which may sort of help elevate this a little bit, is to start doing better economic valuation of the land as the land is being provided to the developers, right? So the ecological and the economic value of the land is right now not getting reflected, and hence the cost effectiveness of doing these large scale solar or RE projects is way more than to do decentralized solar or RE. And you'll see that most of our solar targets are met through large scale solar parks and not through rooftop solar, despite now some push coming via the PM and so on. So the moment you start putting the economics a little bit more balanced by actually evaluating the cost of land adequately and compensating the communities adequately, you'd start seeing the decentralized also picking up. The third thing that I think I would like to add, especially as Nitinji you mentioned, green hydrogen. If you look at the long-term projections of RE deployment in India, right now we are about close to, let's say, 150, 60 odd gigawatt. We want to go to 500 gigawatt by 2030. But the long-term 2070 net zero modeling says that we need to deploy about 7,000 to 8,000 gigawatt of RE. Right? So it's a 20x kind of a magnitude from even the most ambitious targets that we have that we are looking at. Right? So of course, the land requirement, then you can imagine how steeply it is going to go up. Especially for green hydrogen, you need immense amount of renewables to make that happen. So are we making the technology choices also keeping some of these challenges in mind or not? Like a green hydrogen, we are pretty gung-ho about it. But what is the implication on the land in the long term and how that is going to get managed? And I think the final piece I would say is on the economic opportunities. RE projects, especially the large ones, end up creating very limited economic opportunities for the community, even if the community can get some menial jobs, let's say, of cleaning the panels and this, that. The job multiplier is just really very small. Whereas a lot of the bioeconomy, nature-based economic opportunities create way many more jobs per CR of investment, per dollar of revenue generated and so on. So we also need to look at like across the mitigation gamut of opportunities that we have, from a RE to a bamboo-based economy to a natural fiber-based economy to a bio-inputs-based economy and so on and so forth. We need to diversify and not just get stuck with only the RE bandwagon when it comes to climate action, because some of the others can create way many more social positives, job and employment positives for a country like India.
Moving a little bit away from the RE conversation, while very critical, just to add a bit, on the conversation that, which Haripriya was talking about earlier, while a lot of our policies talk about, there's a lot more focus on climate action. I mean, where does conservation fit in? And I mean, if we look at our NDCs, LDN targets, etc., all of it is about tree-based. The NDC is forest and tree cover, for instance. So that's sort of embedded, and that's where I think a lot more we need to have a conversation on how we are thinking about commons itself. I mean, what happens with grasslands, and that's a complicated conversation with wastelands, and that's where it kind of intersects with the RE conversation, later. So the incentives itself need to be designed for different sort of, benefits. So for grasslands, it would look like very differently than when you're talking about just forest and tree cover expansion. And we do have much more policies, incentives, at least for forestry and tree cover. How they are, whether communities are getting all the benefits or not is a different question. There are a lot of regulatory issues. But one way to solve for this is if we are thinking about commons on a larger, and going back to the larger, the earlier point on land-based restoration economy. And I think that's a critical one. And because where we are, it can help local communities to also think about building resilience and what the different economic jobs or opportunities could look like. And this, just from our own learnings that we've sort of seen, in the last few years as well, is there's a huge potential for different kind of farmer producer organization, local groups, startups who are working on different kind of, innovative business models around land. But they are not able to get investments. And I think going back to the point that Shailesh was making earlier as well, we need investments for commons, and the instruments would be, are different, which some of it might be blending of, with public finance. But how do we get more sort of investments from, other sort of sources which can help to build that larger land-based restoration economy, which would mean that, different kind of capacities, how do we think about what kind of business models, one example is the bamboo one, which Abhishek was mentioning, but it could be different for nuts, it could be different for NTFPs, but that would mean that you have MSP for NTFPs, it's actually accessible. While Vandhan Kendras are there, how are we using them, or how, they sort of become part of that larger access, creates that access for local communities to market. So there's a lot of these interconnected issues, and some of this can be linked, it's linked to conservation, coming back to that, because it also means much more conversations around sustainable harvesting, how we think about it, so that it doesn't become an extractive industry, but how we look at it, and communities are more conscious of it, we know already. But how we sort of design some of those incentives becomes critical.
Thank you very much. I think we need to wind up. We are not done too badly in terms of time. I've been asked to say a few words by my sense at the end. First thing I want to say is this. I've been involved in this for a long time, for 40 years. I came back to India 20 years ago, and at that time, most of the work was on raising people's awareness. What I'm delighted about is that 20 years later, that is no longer the problem. That is not the issue. Today, I'm delighted, you have heard these people and how well they have discussed this issue. And our challenge now is action, not raising awareness, of actually getting implementation. And so this is one thing that I would say. Let me just say one thing, that I do not know how many of you have seen the report called Our Commons, which has been put out in time for this. Now, they identify what are called 5 types of commons. The first is forests, the second is pastures, the third is water, the fourth is coastal areas, and the fifth is cultural. Let's leave that culture. I'm not sure culture is that badly affected by climate, but leave that to one side. Take the first 4. It seems to be all 4 are things, all 4 areas of commons are seriously affected by the risks of climate change. But the nature of the response that we require will also vary. In the case of forests, we actually have forest policy, we have forest act, and so on. In the case of water, we are hardly beginning the process. In the case of pasture land, or in terms of coastal areas, we do not even have a basis, organizational or legal basis for working on these areas. So one of the challenges that I would put is, and they will be affected by climate also. So there'll be ad hoc actions taken, but with no regard for the commonality problem. So one of the things that I would urge those of you who are continue to work in this area of commons is to start seeing the differences in these 4 areas. And also the answers that we have to give for connecting positively climate and commons policies is also probably going to be different in each of these areas, and we would have to do that. The second point that I would make is that the one part of this climate is getting sufficient and distinct commercial attention. Commons is not. And one of the answers that we have to seek is, how do we do that? One clear answer which has come out from this is, if you are going to give credits on the climate side, make it carbon plus. Not just on carbon, but on the net impact, including on the other areas of commons, etc., and maybe other things also. So to push the notion of carbon plus. How do I get people in the commercial interested in funding things on commons, though they now seem to be ready to do things on climate, including philanthropists? This is where the notion, which was spoken a little earlier about blended finance, which was mentioned, is something we need to explore and develop a little. Because at the moment, we are completely 100% dependent on government funding when it comes to commons. There is virtually nothing else which is available if you really want to do any work on commons. So I think this is the third area that I would urge you to look at. And I think there is a possibility of trying to do something on blended finance, but that the initial approach, I think, should be to the philanthropists. That get the philanthropists interested, And once they start, then it is possible to have a broader blended finance system. These are some of the things lessons that I think emerge from whatever experience that we've had over the past decades and whatever prospects that lie in front of us. So let me just end by thanking all 5 of them for very good contributions they have made to this. I hope that you have, I'm sure some of you have questions, but we don't really have a procedure for questions here in this huge hall. But you are going to have tea, and you can accost any one of the 5 and ask them questions there. So thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. I request the panelists to be there for a moment. Thank you very much. I think it was an excellent session and we really managed time well. And just for information, sir, and for the audience, the discussion on Carbon Plus Plus will continue tomorrow with something called Community Stewardship session, and discussion on blended finance also is going tomorrow on climate finance session. So we have a lot to discuss and a lot to deliberate. And can I request now Namita to help me in thanking the panelists with a token of appreciation. Thank you, everyone. We'll break for tea, and we have to come back at 4:15 for the final plenary. Thank you.